All righty. We did
Might
it.
then you might be able to get
Yeah,
it later.
and they probably
Oh,
will.
I'm gonna if you can keep yourself muted, that would be great. Since we have a bunch of folks joining. Um, but in the meantime, thank you so much for coming to tonight's Wildlife Wednesday. We're very excited about this. Our topic is about Cook Inlet belugas and their prey, and we're really lucky to have Dr. Bill Bechtol here, a fisheries biologist and friend of the organization, amazing researcher. Um, I wanted to start by giving a little introduction to the Alaska Wildlife Alliance for those of you who are unfamiliar with the organization. We were founded in 1978 by Alaskans who wanted to ensure that as the state developed, we were keeping in mind the health and keeping intact ecosystems for all of Alaska's wildlife. And so our mission is to advocate for healthy ecosystems, scientifically and ethically managed to protect our wildlife for present and future generations. We have three main programs. The first is to help wildlife adapt to climate change. This is our climate program. Our second, which is very relevant to tonight's talk, is recovering threatened and endangered species. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, we do a lot of work with Cook Inlet beluga whales, trying to work towards their recovery. And we have a text alert system. You can text the word beluga to that number below, 833-541-0408, and you'll get a text every time that we and our volunteers see belugas in the Kenai and Kasilof rivers. Teresa Becker, who's in the call, I think is the one who manages that text alert system. So thank you, Teresa. And our third program we call Voices for Wildlife, and this is where we go to these decision-making spaces to represent wildlife and their interests. And so you'll often see that represented at our testimony at the Board of Fish, the Board of Game, venues like that. Uh, Every winter, we host these digital Wildlife Wednesday programs, and this year, our Wildlife Wednesday series is sponsored by Natural Habitat Adventures, aka NatHab. So thank you very much for that support, and you can visit their website to learn more about their trips, which they run around the world, but they have many trips in Alaska as well. So thank you to NatHab. In terms of Zoom etiquette for tonight's program, if you can please keep your microphones muted and your videos off so that we can preserve bandwidth for Bill's presentation. You can also view the presentation in full screen. Bill has a lot of great charts and graphs, and so really want you to see the full picture. And then as the presentation is going, there's a chat feature in the, oh, hold on, Jim. Let me see if I can. Um, Sorry, one second. If you ask your questions in the chat, we'll be able to, we'll have a question and answer period at the end, and I'll be moderating that. So I'll ask your questions to Bill, and we can get that engagement that way. Thank you so much. Follow us if you'd like on Instagram, Facebook. We also have an e-newsletter on our website. You can sign up for that on our homepage. I also really wanted to thank all the AWA members and donors who make this work possible. We couldn't do this without you. And then a little note is that we have an online silent auction for our hibernation celebration that's live. You can find that on our website. There's lots of great gifts and prizes. And then we also have an in-person silent auction and event in Anchorage on December 4th, our hibernation celebration at the Writer's Block, and all that info is available online as well. So without further ado, and I'll try and get these lines out of here, I'd like to introduce Bill to present on Cook Inlet belugas and their prey.
Great, thank you. A little bit of brief background, very brief. So I have a bachelor's in wildlife degree from the University of Washington. My very last portion of that program. I took two fisheries classes, and my life was changed. And so I've been in fisheries ever since. I had relatives in Alaska and came up here. I first worked on a project out at Bristol Bay and then did commercial fishing, worked in canneries like a lot of people do, did odds and ends. And then I joined up with Fish and Game, and I worked for them for 25 years. I worked with salmon and herring and groundfish and shellfish, usually in the Cook Inlet to Prince William Sound area and along the outer coast. After 25 years, I left Fish and Game and went back and got my PhD, and I've been consulting, contracting, working with different entities ever since. A lot of it is with tribal organizations along Kuskokwim and then along the Yukon, and then also here the beluga came in when I served on the beluga whale recovery team to develop the recovery plan. So that came out in 2016. But that kind of brings us to where we are now. I worked on prey for that project, and so have been updating, working with Wildlife Alliance ever since. So let me share my screen here. Let's see. Trying to go to full screen.
I think the little hourglass on the bottom.
Okay, we'll try that again. Let's see. I am not seeing that.
Down by on the bottom right corner, there's just a little bit to the left, there's keep going left and up. There you go. Yeah.
There we go. Okay,
Perfect.
good. Okay, so yeah, again, we'll be talking about cooking up beluga whales and their population. I'm going to start with a little bit of the background of the beluga whales, the threats to recovery, their prey, or what we know about their prey, and kind of a what's next options to understanding. And I want to acknowledge this work more recently and also in the past is funded by Alaska Wildlife Alliance and also the Environmental Investigation Agency, which helped put these updates that we've been doing. As far as the background of the belugas, from 1979 to 1993, the population declined by 50%, although the earlier surveys for those populations are a little uncertain. But anyway, that represented a decline of 50%. From 93 to 98, there was another population decline of 50%. This one was attributed to overharvesting, the previous decline from 79 to 93. They're not real certainty in terms of what was driving that decline, but they're pretty certain that the 93 to 98 was due to overharvesting. This definitely raised some red flags. In 2000, the population was designated as depleted under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Then in 2008, population was listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act, which means there's a chance of going extinct. The recovery plan started to ensue. That was released in 2016 by National Marine Fisheries Service. So this shows you an idea of what the population did. You see that 50% decline from 94 to about 03. Then you see more of a kind of a more stable level beginning in the mid 2000s to really to about present. I showed two different time series here, the solid blue line and the red dots, because the approach used to do the surveys and then to analyze the data has changed quite a bit between these two different time periods. From 2008 to the 2018 survey, population decline continued to decline at an average rate of 2.3% a year. So this is a decline. We've recognized it now as endangered. The population still continues to decline, and there's not a lot of certainty of what driving that decline. You see in 2021 and 2022, there were two back-to-back surveys. And while it looks like, it maybe increased a little bit, it actually, when you go back to 2018 up to 2022, it's an average increase of 0.9% per year. So I don't know what your bank account looks like, but if my bank account is only increasing by 0.9%, I'm glad it's not going down. But on the other hand, it is definitely not increasing by much. I have a big question mark here over 2025. There was a survey that was conducted last spring. Those data will still be analyzed. The federal shutdown did not help, but an actual output of what the population has done since 2022 will probably be available next summer. This is something that doesn't happen overnight. But you get an idea of what the population does. Basically, there's a drastic decline, and then it's not done much since then. In terms of downsizing, downlisting or delisting, however you want to call it, so they were listed as threatened and then endangered. The carrying capacity is based on that 1979 survey, which again is pretty uncertain, but it's the data we have. And so carrying capacity is estimated at 1,300 whales based on that. If you want to downlist, so basically you want to drop the endangered listing and go to more like a threatened, the National Marine Fisheries Service recovery plan says they'd like to see 520 whales, or roughly 40% of the carrying capacity. The other criteria is that they want to see a 25-year positive population trend, that is, increasing population for 25 years, or at least projected to increase. To completely delist, they want to see 60% of the carrying capacity in the population, or basically 780 whales. So at that point, they would consider delisting entirely. So it's not just the numbers that have declined. This shows on the left from back in the 70s what the distribution looked like for the whales. And so this is the distribution during the survey. So this is the summertime or spring, summertime. You can see that it covers roughly down to Tuxedni Bay all the way up into the upper inlet. What you see on the right is a more recent survey, and you see the population has substantially decreased from what it was. If you look into ecological theory, it's pretty clear that when animals are stressed, they basically contract into their preferred habitat. So this is telling us that up in the upper inlet is the preferred habitat. This is a figure out of the recovery plan put together by NMFS. And I think one of the things to point out here is Area 1, up at the very top of the inlet. This is listing of critical habitat. And this area has the highest concentrations of belugas from spring to fall. But also, incidentally, it's also the area that can have the greatest impact from people's activities, from anthropogenic threats. Basically, pollution, any blasting that goes on, any activities such as boats. That's the greatest potential for impacts is up in that Area 1. You look down in Area 2, this is part of the critical habitat based on historical surveys of fall and winter feeding in transit areas. And so the belugas don't concentrate that much in these small areas. They occur in smaller numbers. I also have to reflect back on my time when I was with Fish and Game back in the early 90s. I did some salmon surveys, and down in the very southwest corner of the inlet, I remember one of our surveys seeing about 30 beluga whales down there. So that was something that happened quite a few years ago, and really we haven't seen much of anything since then. There used to be beluga whales that came into Kachemak Bay in kind of that southeast portion, and that was more of a fall. Historically, it sounded like they targeted a smelt that was spawning in the area. But anyway, again, this shows the critical habitat as recognized by the National Marine Fisheries Service Recovery Plan. So what are the threats to recovery? This again is out of the recovery plan, identifies the major threats. And the one I'm going to focus on today is the reduction in prey. So that's a concern. You know, if they can't obtain enough food, that's an issue. The recovery plan had several distinct recommendations. One was to evaluate prey abundance and availability and how that's changed over time. Another was to look at the seasonal, spatial, and size variation in prey diversity. and the quality of prey to improve assessments of relationships between belugas and their prey. Another was to develop a beluga foraging model informed by prey. Basically, what do they need to eat? How can they possibly switch diet if, say, they're targeting a particular species of salmon? That salmon goes down. Can they target something else and maintain their energetic intake? And finally, ensure fisheries management adequately accommodates Cook Inlet beluga prey requirements. For instance, if necessary, do we need to expand the number of species with escapement goals or change the escapement goals for salmon, or what we look at as escapement goals, in order to provide adequate prey for belugas? And for what it's worth, out of these, there really has not been much movement really on any of these aspects of the recommendations. So this looks at the number of stomachs by month. The information is fairly dated. I would draw your attention to the number of stomachs that are sampled. Basically, we've only got 27 stomachs that we have data from. Of those, only 2/3 of them had prey and had something in their stomach. And so basically, that's saying that 1/3 of the stomachs that were sampled had nothing, or nothing that could be identified. And this really kind of triggers to the small number of stomachs that are sampled, of belugas that are sampled. Often they're washed up on a beach, they're stressed, they may be regurgitated, so there's not much left in their stomach. But it gives you an idea of some of the challenges being faced when we're trying to come up with what are they actually eating. In terms of looking at the contents, you'll see that about 94%, almost all of the stomachs that had prey had fish in them. So that's obviously very important to their diet. You can break that down further. 2/3 of them had salmon, around 40% had gadids, and then around 11% had some other species. And then looking at the invertebrates, about half of the stomachs that had prey had invertebrates of one type or another. I would draw your attention, though, to the time of which stomachs were obtained. In this early period, April, May, there's zeros here. There's no stomach samples from this time period, at least in this earlier data. I have talked to Lori Quakenbush, who was the lead on this. She has told me that in terms of what's been sampled recently, they do have a handful more beluga stomachs that have been analyzed or have been collected. They haven't done the analysis, they haven't done the write-up. One thing that caught my attention is that of those, there was 3 stomachs that had lamprey in them. And again, these are from the upper inlet, so they had lamprey in the stomachs. And this was the first time they had documented lamprey in the Cook Inlet beluga diet. So they do occur in the diet, say in Bristol Bay populations, but again, the Cook Inlet beluga is extremely unique. It's an isolated population that does not interbreed with or migrate into other areas. But it was kind of interesting hearing that. Hopefully we'll hear something from Lori in the next year anyway. So again, big thing is most of them had fish, very few in the early part of the year. And so kind of the prey take home, salmon and gadids, also known as cod, and then smelt. And I'm going to stick in eulachon, Pacific eulachon, and I'm going to focus on eulachon as well. But flounder and vertebrates are the main prey items. But again, small sample size, limited spatial coverage, and limited temporal coverage, very limited coverage over time. To switch to eulachon, and we think this eulachon is a very, very important in the springtime. This is at a time when the belugas emerge from a winter of low prey availability. You know, it's been cold. There's not been much in the inlet. There aren't any salmon in the inlet in the wintertime. And they're coming into the spring period where they're giving birth or they're lactating. They're nursing young beluga whales. And their life cycle of beluga whales is about a 2-year period. So they birth 1 year, they're lactating in the next year before they get set up to have a birth 2 years later. Interesting, the eulachon only spend 1 to 3 weeks in fresh water. They are anadromous because they come up and they spawn in the fresh water, but then they go immediately to sea. The adults, I think, for the most part, most of what I've seen suggests that the adults basically die. The larvae that are come out, they're hatched as eggs. They turn or they're laid as eggs that have an adhesive characteristics, so they stick to material. Then they hatch into larvae, and immediately they go out to sea. The thing about the older fish in particular is they have a 17 to 20% oil content, so they're extremely rich. And in fact, this is where you get the term candlefish. I've actually not done it myself, but you can take a eulachon that's been dried out and actually light it on fire. Just light it with a match. They're that rich in oil. So that's very important to belugas in the spring. But unfortunately, we don't have much in the way of diet of belugas in that April-May period. Eulachon are important for commercial, subsistence, and personal use fisheries in the upper inlet. And I'll talk about each of these in a little bit as we go along, but the commercial fishery occurs in the mouth of the Susitna River, is managed for what I would call an arbitrary annual harvest limit. The personal use and subsistence harvests are unlimited. There are no restrictions on them other than gear type, but they're also very relatively minor compared to the commercial harvest. So what do we have on population trends? This shows you the Pacific or personal use harvest, what I'm calling the personal use harvest for eulachon. In the areas that are shown on the graph or in the figure on the lower left are depicted in the graph above. Obviously, Anchorage is listed as the highest harvest area, and Anchorage really is the 20-mile river in Turnagain Arm. So that's all 20-mile river. The Kenai Peninsula freshwater is probably the second highest catch, and that's represented by the Kenai River and the Kasilof River, which the eulachon go into. And then you see the Susitna River, which seems to have been more important in the late 90s and has dropped off. But I would point out that, again, this is based on the statewide mail-out survey. And I don't know how many of you have received that survey. It's mailed to a random selection of people who obtain sport fishing licenses in a given year. And so it's mailed out. If you happen to fish, say, in the Turnagain Arm area, then you would be listed as Anchorage on this survey, but it's not directed at a personal use harvest. So again, it's from the mail-out survey. Survey data are analyzed by area. If there's insufficient numbers of sample sizes, and I forget exactly the number, it's not that many, but if they don't get enough samples, say from the Susitna River, then that data is pooled into another area or dropped. But again, there is no harvest survey specific to personal use, so there can be confusion in some categories. For instance, if you're fishing in Turnagain Arm, are you fishing in freshwater or saltwater? Some people might be confused. They might say, well, no, I was in Turnagain Arm, so I was on the Kenai Peninsula. Some confusion there on area fished. So again, the bottom line, personal use estimates are largely undocumented, and in terms of the mail-out survey, hugely underestimate the local and total harvest. And in fact, I would make a point. I talked to one of the regional supervisors for sport fish, and I asked him about, is there any survey specific to eulachon? He's like, no, we don't do anything. They had no idea that they even had this data in there. So that was kind of a surprise. But the bottom line is the magnitude of personal use harvests are substantially less than what we see in Upper Cook Inlet commercial harvest. And here's what the Upper Cook Inlet commercial harvest look like. So the harvest limit is this broad dashed line. There was actually 4 harvests that occurred prior to this time. The commercial harvest was shut down during the early 2000s as the forage fish management plan was developed. Basically, that plan, statewide plan, says you cannot have a fishery on a forage fish unless you have a specific management plan. So they developed one for the Upper Cook Inlet. They came back with a harvest level of 100 tons. And in 2016, they raised that to 200 tons. Then in 2024, we took that to the board. The board approved a reduction back to 100 tons. The other thing I'd point out here is there's actually very few permit holders. You know, a handful of permit holders, 5 permit holders in 2025 harvested 100 tons. So talk about somebody that's Armstrong. I mean, these people are impressive because one of the criteria for this fishery is that only hand dip net can be used. You can't use a gill net. It's only hand dip netting. So those people are harvesting 100 tons by dip net. And they have to report their catch daily. They have to pre-register. Again, it's only in the mouth of the Susitna River. And surprisingly, it's a very short duration fishery. Basically, they wait, the fish come in, they hit them. In 2025, they took the entire 100-ton harvest in 3 days, all 5 permit holders. And I should clarify as well that the permit holders, that's one permit holder, but that permit holder can have several different people dip netting for that person. Again, we don't know a lot about the commercial fishing impact on eulachon population. We don't know a lot about the eulachon population in general. So we also don't know the effects of the Yukon fisheries on the Cook Inlet beluga population. So what do we know about the Susitna River eulachon? Well, there was a study back in 1982 to 1983 that just looked at spawning distribution and collected samples on age, sex, and size. Our current Fish and Game Commissioner was actually a young biologist on the project at the time. In 2013, there was a hydroacoustic study, a sonar study that was conducted as part of a Sioux hydro study. It collected relative passage information and age, sex, and size composition. And then in 2016, Fish and Game conducted actually the first population estimate of eulachon spawning in the Susitna River. And they based this on sampling of eulachon, how many eggs do the females on average have, and then realizing that the larvae move downriver almost immediately. They sampled the larvae going downriver and back calculated to how many fish had to spawn to produce that many larvae. But again, there's no annual assessment. These are the only 3 studies that have really looked at eulachon. And so we took to the Board of Fisheries, we said, you know, we've got this big fishery here. You're harvesting 100 tons. We're concerned about Cook Inlet beluga whales. We don't have any idea of the impact of this fishery on beluga whales. We don't have any idea of the impact of this fishery on the eulachon population. So the Board of Fish reduced that harvest back to 100 tons, and that's where it is now. We've got concerns and wanted to look at other options in terms of trying to come up with an estimate. We put in a proposal to the North Pacific Research Board in 2024 to reconduct basically the 2013 study, but expand it somewhat. We received 2 very good recommendations from peer reviews and 1 good recommendation, but ultimately it was suggested that we resubmit. And then of course our funding changed, so that's all under review right now. We're looking at a resubmission, possibly with the lead of the Tyonek Tribal Conservation District heading up the project, in which case we would submit to the NPRB again, but it would only be a 1-year study, which is what their NPRB is saying right now they will allow. This basically is a schematic of what we would look at in terms of our survey. So we would have a sonar site up here that's the same site that was used in 2013. We would conduct dip netting to collect samples and also look at an index, you know, are we getting high rates or low rates per hour? As an indicator, Fish and Game did these 3 study sites when they dip netted. We would also use a drone to do reconnaissance. This is very braided over here, but we try and use a drone to see what sort of population is spawning or at least going over there in terms of the eulachon. We're looking at other options as well. Here's the Kenai River. It turns out that when they set up the Kenai River, that's well before sonar, that's well before the salmon arrive. And it turns out eulachon arrive as well, typically after the sonar setup, not always, but typically. And we are wondering, well, can we look at this as a possible index? So Anna Marie Mueller looked at this, and this is the sonar on the Kenai River set up before the salmon arrive. You can get an idea of the density of fish going through. It's just an incredible density. And so she went through the years 2013 to 2024 to try and develop, again, a relative index. We're going to try and see if we can relate this to other things in the inlet, but just give you an idea. So if we don't have data on Yukon up in the upper inlet, where else can we look? Well, there was trawl surveys conducted by Fish and Game down in the lower inlet. Small mesh trawl survey was actually a survey targeting shrimp. Large mesh survey targeting cod and tanner crab. They show relatively high populations around the early 2000s, dropping after that. But I would point out that these surveys have largely been discontinued. Budget cuts, these are no longer being conducted, so that's not really a source of information. In other areas, so looking out even farther, we have Cook Inlet here. Oops, there we go. And the red line here shows the area around Kodiak, Marmot Bay, and Chignik. The broader distribution of squares shows a National Marine Fisheries Service trawl survey that's conducted every year. And it's not an ideal survey, but it provides an index again. And so here's the small mesh trawl survey conducted around the Kodiak area. You again see fairly high numbers in the mid 2000s to mid 2010s. Again, dropping off because these surveys have been cut. Here's the Northern Gulf of Alaska survey conducted by National Marine Fisheries Service. You get an idea of frequency of occurrence, among other things, fairly high occurrence, fairly consistent for Yukon occurring in these trawl surveys on average. Population of biomass estimate goes up and down, obviously. This survey, the analysis of Yukon only occurs every couple of years, so this is not being conducted right now. So what about Cook Inlet salmon? I won't spend a lot of time on that because people are pretty well briefed on it, but I'm going to focus on the northern district, this upper portion where belugas occur. This looks at the harvest over time. You can see in all of Cook Inlet, obviously driven by sockeye. This is mainly going to the Kenai River and Kasilof River areas. If you look strictly at the northern district, and this is, again, averaged over time, over 10-year increments, except most recently, you see sockeye is still pretty important. Coho become pretty important as well in the northern district. Some of these fisheries have obviously been restricted because of concerns over the salmon population. So that's another thing that's inhibiting available data. I don't want to overwhelm you right here, but I do want to show this is some possible data sets to be looked at. These are things that I've kind of played with a little bit and looked at. You can see that harvest is probably the most readily available data. And if I have an asterisk in a box here, it means we have data for that. So even if the catch was zero, we have information on whether a fishery occurred. If there was some catch, like Northern District Chinook, which is very small, but there's still some catch. Some of these other things in terms of escapement, obviously we get into escapement to the rivers, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. But one thing to keep in mind on escapement is, again, the Board of Fish, or excuse me, the Fish and Game has been going through budget cuts. And so they've had to prioritize and change some of their escapement goals. So if you're looking at long-term data, some of these systems don't have a whole lot of long-term data. And some of the systems that maybe used to be fairly long-term data, if you have a tributary that splits and you previously had a weir on each system, with the budget cut, they might have stopped that two-system analysis, put a weir farther down, and tried to use that. So it's not exactly comparable to what your historical data are. But as I showed, some of these surveys down at the bottom here are not conducted much anymore. So there's other focus studies that I'll briefly talk about. So Stephanie Norman led a crew that put out a paper in 2020. They looked at the Deshka River, and I mentioned the long-term data sets. So the Deshka River is one of the long-term data sets. They wanted to look at some of the other tributaries in the upper inlet and see if they could make a link to Cook Inlet belugas. And there just weren't very many systems that had long-term data, so they stuck basically to the Deshka. They determined that Chinook and coho salmon returns were highly correlated with Cook Inlet beluga whale. In the case of Chinook, they're correlated the year before, or the year of, the year before, and 2 years before the birth of a calf. In terms of coho, correlated with Cook Inlet beluga year in the year of and the year prior to birth. And one of the conclusions of this paper, excuse me, was that if you wanted to have a positive benefit to the Cook Inlet beluga whales, you basically had to double the size of the escapement goals for these stocks. As you can imagine, this probably was a pretty controversial comment, and of course it hadn't really happened. Working with Alaska Wildlife Alliance and EIA and some others, we did put in a proposal to expand on this work. We put in a proposal to the Marine Mammal Commission to expand on this work, with the idea that maybe we could expand to a couple other tributaries. And the other thing that I was tremendously interested in, could we include the harvest in the northern district of salmon and see if we could relate that to Cook Inlet belugas? But again, we did not get funded for that. The other thing to keep in mind when we're talking about salmon, there's been a definite and pronounced decline in both the number of older fish and the size of salmon at age. And I'm showing Chinook here. So you can see the average fish size for the Kenai and the Deshka on the right. And this is the average of all fish that are sampled in a given year. If you look at the left, you see a decline of 4 ocean fish is a solid line, 3 ocean fish is a dotted line, and 2 ocean fish is a dashed line. And you can see that for at least 3 ocean, and depending upon the area, 4 ocean and 3 ocean in the Deshka, there's been a definite decline. And so what's going on here, overall, we're getting fewer old fish, and I think people can tell you that, but also we're getting smaller fish at age. And this has implications not only for the belugas, but also for, productivity of the stock of the salmon. So basically, in terms of the belugas, if you have smaller salmon and you think, okay, belugas need to eat however many, just throw out a number, 500 fish in a year. Well, they may have to eat more because these fish are now smaller. In terms of productivity and management of the salmon, now we're getting smaller number of eggs, and most of the salmon management, it's based on the number of fish that reach the spawning grounds. But for the most part, there's no consideration of egg productivity. So that's another consideration in terms of the future. In terms of other studies, so Jones et al. Looked at Chinook salmon across these 15 Cook Inlet tributaries, different types of systems, in terms of trying to determine what the impacts of increased precipitation and increased water temperature, basically climate change, would have on spawning and rearing. And increased precipitation decreased productivity overall. So if you have a lot of spring or fall flooding after the eggs are deposited, that can really knock back your population. If in terms of the increased temperature, it really depended on the particular system. If you have a system that's maybe on average warmer than the others, if you warm it even more, it becomes less productive. If you have a system that's slightly cooler than others and you warm it, it could actually become more productive. So it really varied by tributary, but still something to think about. We had reached out to the authors in terms of trying to replicate this study. And basically the conclusion was that it's too soon to the previous study, that they wanted to wait a few more years, allow more data to accumulate. So the other thing I'd point out, I want to jump to, is eDNA sampling and passive acoustics. And this has been fairly new field. Basically, eDNA is sampling the water for DNA of fish and animals that have been in the water. Anything that gets in the water can spread DNA, and that can be sampled. This was combined with passive acoustics. So basically you set up a hydrophone listening in a river. And so this was done in 2022. It was interesting that they found Cook Inlet beluga whales in the Kenai, but not in the Kasilof, even though, there's fish populations in both. And they found that the Cook Inlet beluga whales didn't come in until later in the fall after the prime run of the salmon was over. And one of the aspects that was possibly offered up is there's lots of boating and noise going on in the Kenai, and it seems like that the belugas are sensitive to noise. Um, in terms of passive acoustics, and I'd really like to look more into this, but there was a study that looked at to Sydney Bay and Chinitna River, Chinitna Bay, and this was over the winter. They again put some receivers out there. They determined that there were Cook Inlet beluga whales feeding in the wintertime into Sydney, which is, is really quite a bit south, and it's surprising. Um, Cook Inlet beluga whales were detected in the Chinitna River, but not in the bay itself, which is kind of odd. But again, they're using hydrophones that are out there. They can tell by the sound of what they're feeding that they are feeding as opposed to just being there. And I'm really curious about where that might go. And I'd like to know what sort of fish are there. So I see I'm looking at my clock, so I'm going to run real quick through this. So these are the gadids and the flounders, and I'm going to focus on, again, Kachemak Bay here on the bottom right and Kamishak Bay on the bottom left. And again, these are those same surveys, that large mesh survey. And again, we don't have anything since about 2018, but we see these populations kind of on a decline. And so if the belugas in the upper inlet are feeding on populations going through the same possible changes, then it might be a concern. So where to go next? Again, we could compare Kenai Yulicon data to other areas, but we need to come up with data for other areas. Looking at the Upper Cook Inlet Yulicon, I'm very curious about genetically, are they related to the Yulicon we see in the surveys down in the Lower Cook Inlet? It wouldn't surprise me if the larvae go out to sea, they go down, they basically rear in the lower inlet before they come back and spawn. We won't know a lot of stuff until we reinstate multi-species surveys in the Lower Cook Inlet. It would be good to determine what prey resources are available from fall to spring, and to determine especially what resources are available in general out in the open water. I've talked to some skippers who did some surveys for fish and game in the upper inlet. It's a very tricky place, not only because of the currents, but they said there's just an incredible amount of stuff, of garbage on the bottom, basically steel, pipes, things are on the bottom of the inlet that complicate doing surveys up there. So we also want to explore who's sitting a Yulicon link and looking at that productivity. And this might involve something like a mass balance model where you know the biomass of the population that's available for different species at one trophic level and what's the next trophic level up. So you build it that way. So again, the future, very inconsistent in terms of data, future surveys, uncertain given budgets, and also given agency priorities. And so with that, I would take any questions.
Wow, thank you, Bill. Yeah, folks can start. We've already had some questions in the chat, so please keep sending those. We have some applause. Yes, so while you're writing your questions, and then I'll go ahead and ask those of you, Bill, I wanted to highlight a couple of things. First, thank you so much. This has been a tremendous amount of work to collect um, all those data and summarize it into this presentation. But one of the key points I think to take away from this is that the role of nonprofits and community groups in the face of that uncertainty is really important. And so we want to thank everyone who supports local nonprofits who are working in this fisheries management world. Um, Another update is Bill had mentioned the Board of Fish proposal that we put forward recently. I just dropped in the chat a blog post about that proposal so you can learn more about that process and what went into that. It was a really, for those of you who have participated in Board of Fish, it can be a tough venue, and so we were really excited to have that proposal pass. Also, for folks in the Cook Inlet area, we are a member of the Alaska Beluga Monitoring Program, AKBMP. I see a lot of volunteers here, but if you are interested in volunteering to monitor these whales, you can visit akbmp.org and learn more. Um, and then the final note before I get to your great questions is that Bill has put together all the information, much expounded, um, into a report summarizing what we know about beluga prey, when they're surveyed, where the data gaps are, and some recommendations for things that we can do to improve their prey availability. And we're working on making a summarized kind of glossy version that'll be available for the public later this winter. So if you want to learn more about that, keep up with us on our website, and we'll be presenting that fairly soon. With that, Bill, I'm going to ask you a couple questions from the Stam family. Yeah, this is one I was curious to know more about, but how do, when you were talking about stomach samples, how are those stomachs sampled? Can you expound on the process a little bit?
Yeah, if the animal's actually dead, they can actually retrieve the stomach. But if the animal is still having a chance of surviving, what they do is they stick a hose in it and pump water into it. So that at that point they pump the stomach contents out and collect it in a bucket and then sift through it and sort it. So
Sounds, yeah. So they're often, I mean, they're stranded whales, essentially. They're not sampling stomachs of whales that are
right,
swimming around.
right.
Yeah,
No, and that's one of the big issues with, how do we try and understand a population that's endangered, and you can't get close to them. You can't tag them. I mean, there's very limited that you can do. And just to I see kind of jumping ahead, and I'll come back to the other question, but in terms of sampling the feces, this is the same sort of thing. Can we they do this with other whales? Can we in fact get close enough to where we collect feces? It's like maybe you can have a drone and somebody there with a boat, but you still can't get too close. And the problem with the inlet is the color of the water of the inlet. Uh, when you get feces released, it's pretty hard to keep track of that. I think the opinion I'm hearing is it'd be very hard to collect feces. So
yeah, those are great questions. Thank you for those. Um, Diane asked that you mentioned that there had not been much movement on the Cook Inlet Blue Recovery Plan recommendations, um, particularly determining whether there's a need to adjust escapement for salmon, but for other species as well. So the question is, why hasn't there been much movement on that recommendation?
if you look at the population dynamics, spawner recruit models that Fish and Game uses, and this is not to say that it's wrong, but productivity has been changing. We recognize that. And so when you look at your long-term productivity, you usually look at a long-term average. Now you can adjust it for more recently, the smaller productivity that you seem to be getting more recently. And I think one of the things that drives is when you see escapement goals for particular systems. I'm kind of surprised when, okay, a population may be, having a little bit of trouble or not quite as strong, and the escapement goal gets dropped because you're still looking at the maximum sustainable yield for where the population is. And so that's an aspect that I think we're really starting to grapple with. We're starting to grapple with, can we look at things like fecundity? There was a very interesting study that came out this last fall, or yeah, not long ago, let me put it that way. Interesting study that came out, and they were actually looking at the mass of eggs in female salmon and how that would change your productivity and estimating productivity and future recruitment. And one of the things that they recommended out of that was that if you have a spawning goal range, which most of the systems do, if you have spawning goal range, if you're in uncertain productivity, you're actually better off targeting the upper end of that escapement goal. And yet the standard ecological theory in previous years has been that anything within a given range is going to, in the long term, produce the same returns in terms of adult spawners. But now we're starting to think, well, the fish size is declining, fecundity is declining. Maybe we should target the upper end to take advantage when things are better. So it's just a different way of looking at things, and it's obviously going to take a while to sink in.
And for those who uh, might not have the same biological background, what does fecundity mean?
So fecundity is the number of eggs per fish. So, I mean, they go out, they dig their redds, and it's a pretty big difference if you have a decline in average fish size of, say, 20 millimeters, 30 millimeters. You can get a pretty major drop in fecundity. I should have included that graphic. There's a great graphic that shows about a 30% decline for not that much decline in size of the female spawner.
And one comment on this as well, Diane, the recovery plan put forward many recommendations, and most of them require a management decision to happen for state fisheries that is taken up by the Board of Fish, and so I think there's a big element of sort of political and social will, and our system is not totally set up to allocate to non-humans. And so when we talk about allocation in fisheries, we're often talking about allocation between commercial, personal use, um, et cetera. And so allocating for non-humans like Cook Inlet beluga whales is a little bit trickier of an ask. And so there's also kind of a management paradigm, I think, that's at play for a lot of these recommendations. But turning to the Yulikan in the Susitna River Delta, Teresa asked, if you use sonar in the Susitna Delta to track Yulikan, are you concerned that it will harm the belugas? As many of you know, belugas are very noise sensitive. Um, and curious your thoughts on that, Bill.
Sure that that would be a major concern. The sonar is really upriver, so it's about 17 miles. There are the occasional beluga that gets up there, from what I've heard, but there's really not many belugas that get up that far. They tend to stay down in the delta, and where it's fairly starts to shallow up. I guess I would say that's kind of their foraging behaviors. They go into areas and where it's fairly shallow, where the prey can be concentrated and take advantage of that.
Yeah, and for some additional context on that, when the Board of Fish proposal was passed to reduce the commercial Yulicon harvest, one of the concerns that we had is that there had not been a Yulicon population survey done. There was plans for ADF&G to conduct a 3-year survey, and correct me if I'm wrong, Phil, but only one of those 3 years was conducted before there were some budget cuts. And so that was a commitment that we wanted to make, was to learn more about the status of Yulicon and the Susitna. So again, with funding cuts, it's been a little difficult, but we do still hope to pursue that research. Um, Another question from Diane, is there a point where the plan that was proposed, and this is the recovery plan, to address the endangered status of belugas, um, was revisited or updated?
And
As
to be
Bill
honest,
was on the team, so this is a good.
I don't know where we are on that right now, and I don't know what forces a revisit. And it could be it's not. It could be it doesn't get revisited until the numbers increase. I'm not sure. I know in some other contexts that I deal with with the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. If a species is listed as overfished, that starts a timeline that you have to address the management plan on a fairly periodic basis. And that, as far as I know, I don't know that that's the case here with Cook Inlet belugas, because it's a whole different, it's not an overfished issue, it's an endangered status. So that's a good question, Diane, and I don't know.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. This is your last chance to enter into the chat. Rich asks, the lower Cook Inlet herring declined dramatically in the mid 1990s. And he asks, do you have any thoughts about whether that made an impact on belugas?
Yeah, there weren't a lot of belugas down in that area at the time, Rich. There was some. I don't know. I know I was actually kind of the research biologist at the time when the herring started to decline, and I remember uh, very vociferously trying to talk to the managers who were over in Kamishak. I was in Homer at the time, and they had two openings already, and they were talking about another one, and I said, no, we shouldn't do that, but they did, and they still didn't catch any herring, and it really hasn't opened up much since then. So I don't know in terms of the belugas. They're so concentrated, they're so few now that, again, kind of following the ecological theory, they should be concentrated in the areas of their preferred habitat, which I think they are.
Yeah, and that's a good point concerning Alaska Wildlife Alliance's focus on beluga recovery, um, is that the per what Bill had mentioned in some recent studies that um, the reigning thinking is that belugas are declining because it's death by a thousand cuts is what we hear a lot. There are a lot of contributing factors, a lot of cumulative effects. There's not necessarily one silver bullet, but some research suggests that if belugas had enough to eat, they would be more capable of withstanding those threats over time. And so for our organization, the priorities that we have for beluga whale recovery are to increase their prey availability and to reduce pollution or contamination. And so those are the two issues within the recovery plan that we've focused on. Um, but it's very hard to target, like one specific element at this point in their recovery. So uh, that I think wraps up our questions. Perfect amount of time. Thank you so much, Bill, for presenting on this. Thank you so much to everyone who joined and asked great questions. If you would like to applause or leave a note in the chat for Bill, that's the best way that we can thank him for his time. And again, if you'd like to stay updated on this work, you can follow us on all of the social platforms. Oh my gosh, I see hands exploding all
Thank
over the
you,
screen.
everybody.
And we'll be in touch soon. Our next Wildlife Wednesday is in December, and that's on the upcoming Board of Game proposals for Southeast and South Central. So we hope to see you there. Thanks, everyone.